Now we want to configure database in our product API. We have already added the NuGet package. So first thing that we have to do is we need to create a DbContext for our product API. Now in traditional application, what was happening is we only have one database for the complete application. Microservices work differently. Here, each small API will have its own database. So you can think of that each API will be given to a team who will be responsible to maintain that. So everything will be isolated. So we will need a separate database for our product API, which will only be responsible for maintaining all of the products that we have. So in here, let's right click, add a new folder, and we will call this DbContexts. We'll right click here, then we will add a new class file. We will call this application DbContext. In order to use Entity Framework Core and DbContext, this must inherit from the DbContext. It will be DbContext without the S. Do not confuse it with DbContext because that is just the folder name. So we'll remove that. We'll press Ctrl dot to add a using statement of Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. Once we have that, then we need to create a constructor. We will type CTOR and we'll press tab twice. In here, we need to pass the DbContext options, and there we have to pass the class name, which is application DbContext. We'll say options, and we will pass that to the base class, which is DbContext. That is something general that we have been doing so far with all of the DbContext in any beginner course that you follow. Then we need to create a DB set here. But before that, we need to create a model inside the product API. Before we add that model, let me open up the startup class file and configure our database. So for configurations, we have the configure services. Right here, we will be adding the DbContext. So on services, we have add DbContext, and the class name that we have is application DbContext, and then we have to configure options. We need to configure the connection string here. So for that connection string, we'll say options dot. We'll have a method here which is use SQL Server that is inside Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. So we will have to add that using statement, and after that we need to get connection string from appsettings.json file. We have not added that, but we will add that in just a second. Here we will give that a name of default connection to be consistent. That's all that we have to do inside the configure services. We need to set up our connection string here. Here we need to first define a key that will be connection tree, and then inside the value we have to give it a name. If we go to our startup class file, we are calling that name as default connection, so we'll have to copy and paste that right here. You cannot have any other spellings in connection strings. It must be spelled exactly like this, and default connection should match what you are writing inside the get connection string. That will retrieve the connection string from here and configure our DbContext. Then here we have to write the connection string. What I have pasted here is just a server equal to semicolon, database equal to semicolon, and then trusted connection is true and multiple active result sets is true. We have to go to our SQL Server now. Here, let's try to connect to a database. Server name, it can be either a dot, localhost, or MS SQL local DB. Whatever works for you, enter that and connect here. I was just using a dot, so that is what I will use for the server name. So that will be just a dot, which stands for the local server. Then we need a database name. I will call this as product API, or rather let me say Mango product API. With that, our database is configured in startup class file, and we have the DbContext. In the next video, we need to create a model for product and create that in our database.